If you're in the process of crafting a research proposal for a dissertation, a thesis, or some sort of research project, this video is for you. And it's a little different from our usual content. In this video, we're unveiling a recording of our popular Proposal Writing 101 webinar, which has been attended by thousands of students over the last year. The webinar is hosted by one of our trusty grad coaches, Dr. Kerryn Warren, and it covers pretty much everything you need to put together a high-quality research proposal. So grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit back, relax, and enjoy the webinar.
Hi, Derek. Thank you so much. Yes, so as you mentioned, today we're going to be looking at Research Proposal 101, basically just making sure that you have a high-level idea as to what it is that you're planning on presenting, what it is that whoever you are handing this into, are looking for, and what a proposal usually entails and might look like. I think for today, it is worth at least starting off with the definition of a research proposal. So, in general, we can think of a research proposal as a structured, formal document that you're handing in to, and we'll discuss who to in a moment, a department, a supervisor, someone, in order to showcase three key things. Those things are what your research topic is going to be on, what your research is going to be doing, why you are researching that topic, what is your justification for researching that topic, and then three, how are you planning on investigating it? How are you planning on conducting this research? So that is your research approach, your research methodology. That is the more practical elements. And so often in a research proposal, if it's very clear what you're planning on doing, why it's relevant, and how it is that you're planning on doing it, then you've usually hit the key areas of what a research proposal is meant to have and what is meant to compose of. For the purposes of being inclusive, it is very worth noting that a research proposal can mean a lot of different things. So even within that definition that's provided, there is a huge spectrum as to what we might call the research proposal. On the one side of the spectrum, you might almost have an inquiry of a research proposal. Perhaps you are applying to become a part of a department, or to become a student in a particular institution, in which case your proposal is a part of an application. You might also be applying for funding, where you have just a vague idea as to what you're wanting to study, but you're wanting to maybe get money for the time that you do get it, by the time you do get accepted and can conduct those studies. You also have research proposals that are part of a program, so maybe a master's program, where the majority of the marks come from coursework, or an undergraduate where you've done all of your coursework up to this point, and now in your final semester, your final few months, now you've got to conduct some research and hand in a little bit of a bigger, more independent project. Commonly, a research proposal is also part of a master's or PhD dissertation program. So you are only doing your dissertation work during your master's and PhD. And while that is happening, you are expected to produce a proposal to showcase the department or your supervisor that you're on track and that you have the bare bones necessary to get started with your own research. This will happen early on in your studies. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you'll have US PhDs, where they'll consider their proposal as the first entire 3 chapters of their dissertation. So the majority of perhaps their write-up might have already been done, depending on the size of those chapters, but they're not necessarily yet allowed to conduct the research themselves itself. So they're not necessarily yet allowed to data collect, or to get their surveys out or start their interviews or anything like that, because it needs to go through a committee. They need to defend their current proposal, etc. So with all this in mind, a research proposal can be anything from a filled out template, or a couple of pages that you're sending through to the application, to the first full 3 chapters of your PhD. However, for the vast majority, they tend to sort of hover between somewhere between 3 pages for a shorter one and 12 pages for something a little chunk during your master's and PhD programs. And The reason that that's relevant is because despite this huge amount of variation, there's still a lot of consistency in terms of expectation and the intention behind the proposal. First and foremost, your proposal is meant to convince. It's meant to convince your funders that you are eligible under their criteria for funding, and that with your research is under the kind of research that they like to sponsor and is valuable and possible. If you're sending out your proposal to a committee who will end up, deciding whether you go through to the next stage of your research, then it's there to convince them that you have a solid research plan. If you are sending it through to a department and they're going to use it to assign you a supervisor, you need to convince them that you have a clear understanding as to what kind of research you're interested in doing so that they can assign you to somebody, plausible for you. So, with all this in mind, it's worth now thinking about what goes into a research proposal. Now, remember, I did say that a research proposal can be highly variable. So, for the people on the one side of the spectrum, almost everything that I'm going to be speaking about will be included, and probably quite a bit more. But we do have resources that can help you with that. So don't be shy. Don't be shy to check out those if we don't touch on every single component that's required. And on the other side of the spectrum, they might actually ask you for far less. So this is just to sort of give you a sense as to what normally goes into a proposal in order to achieve those sort of three main components: the telling the reader what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. So to break it down, the first point that I'd like to make clear, and this kind of goes there, is that because there's so much variability around what goes into a proposal, definitely check your institution's requirements, because it doesn't matter what we cover here today. If they're asking for a letter about your childhood experiences and how it led you here, then that's what they're wanting. What that won't really necessarily be a proposal, but if that's really what they're wanting from you, you have to sort of adhere to their institutional requirements. Otherwise, your proposal just won't be hitting what they're looking for. Many institutions also provide some kind of template as to what they'd like. So you can use that template along with maybe some of the points that you learned from this webinar to kind of see where those overlaps are. But first and foremost, check out those institutional requirements. Another point is that if you do have access to past proposals, what other people have written or how they've written it, definitely look through those just to sort of get a sense as to maybe the kinds of quality that do pass and go into the next phase of whatever it is that you're doing, because that can be very valuable for you and how you approach your proposal writing. But when thinking about what goes into a proposal, let's use an example. And in this example, the topic that we're using is exploring the factors related to burnout among graduate students in a UK university. The topic is key in a proposal. It is meant to be a very clear couple of lines that gets to the heart of what it is that you're doing and is clear enough for the reader to already start imagining what that might look like. We have a whole webinar on what research topics, and we have some other resources here as well. So if you're wanting to see whether what you're planning on doing is nice and concisely described in your topic, definitely check those out. But for now, this one is the relatively good one. We know that that you're studying burnout. We know that it's among graduate students in a UK university. If you're part of a UK university, chances are your ability to access graduate students is a little higher. So this is a very high level topic that could go into something like a master's program, probably related to psychology or something along those lines. So maybe not even a program, maybe even a full dissertation where you do your master's only with a dissertation. And this also is probably a qualitative project that I can see when looking at this research topic. So the topic is nice and clear and already tells the reader a lot about what it is that you're planning on doing. Next sections, actually, maybe it might be one section, it might be multiple, is this introduction. I'm going to call this introduction. What I mean by the introduction can be split up into multiple things. You might be asked to provide a background or some kind of context so that the reader knows the terms that you're using, and maybe some real life examples as to how those terms or why this kind of topic is generally relevant for the broader society. So they'll need to know some context. They'll also need to know what the problem is that you as the researcher are planning on solving. So essentially, why is it that we need to understand the factors related to burnout of undergraduate students in the UK university? Is there perhaps a high dropout level among graduate students in that university? Are we trying to figure out whether there's something that the university can do to mitigate or reduce the feelings of burnout that graduate students might be experiencing? If that's the case, the problem would be that we currently don't know what is leading towards burnout, and we need to find out in order to create those policies. Which brings us to the justification or the rationale behind this research, which can also be a part of the introduction. It can be just a couple of lines saying, therefore, this can be very useful at creating policies or creating change within the institution as a whole that could lead to a more welcoming graduate school university environment, if you will. And finally, you will need to put in your aims and objectives. So, how all of that leads to your research on exploring the factors related to burnout. So, we can always unpack that through some of the other resources at Grad Coach, like the Golden Thread, where you have your topic, your aims and objectives clearly articulated. But in general, the important thing about the introduction is you're presenting enough information so that we truly understand why it is that you're doing this and what those components of your research topic actually mean at a real life level. Another thing that typically goes into the research proposal is the literature review. Now, unless you're doing a US PhD, the literature review can be very contained, very small. It can maybe even just be a couple of paragraphs or a couple of pages. You often only need, over maybe 10 references, but you don't necessarily need 300 references in your literature review. So a literature review, the important things that you need to get across in a small literature review is that you have some kind of theoretical background around these topics, at least somewhat understood. So, for instance, you will need to have a little bit of understanding as to what other people have proposed causes burnout. You'd probably also want an understanding as to how you would define burnout at an academic level, not just the general level that you would have presented in the introduction. So we need a little bit more of an academic theory or explanation behind what it is that you think is going to come out of this kind of research. You also need to present the research gap very clearly. So you'll need to say, despite all this knowledge we currently have, we still don't understand it at this level or at this university, or there's still a lot to be understood and missing in the current discourse, or a lot of arguments in the current discourse. If you say that or something along those lines, you'd be hitting the nail right on the head by showing that your research has academic relevance. In other words, why it is that your research is important at an academic level. What niche does it fill or help shed light on within the broader literature? The next thing that goes in is the methodology. Once again, unless you're doing a US PhD, then this methodology can be relatively concise. But regardless of what it is that you're going to be doing, or how it is that you're planning on conducting this research, there is a little bit of a balance between providing a huge amount of knowledge in the sense that you know exactly what stats you're going to be using if you're doing a quantitative research, the exact steps for every single phase of the research. You probably don't need to present all of that, but you do want to showcase a high level understanding around the practical elements that will be involved in this research. For instance, in a topic like exploring the factors related to burnout among graduate students in the UK university, my personal instinct looking at that topic is that this is really qualitative research. But qualitative research is a very broad term. It will be very useful for me as the reader to know what kind of qualitative research you're going to be doing. Are you going to be using focus groups or interviews? Are those interviews going to be structured or semi structured in nature? And if you don't know all those terms just yet, that's okay. But the important thing is that you start breaking it down, not just into very general, like qualitative versus quantitative kinds of methods, but you're able to at least unpack maybe a little bit of extra information as to whether if you are going to be doing interviews, some of your questions might be prepared and some of them might be open-ended to allow for new information to be given to you. That would be called a semi-structured interview. It's probably also a good idea to show that you have a practical understanding as to what an interview entails. So if you say that you're going to be interviewing 300 people, I, as a researcher, will pretty much know that that's very difficult to do just practically. That's a lot of interviews that you have to go through. And you probably only will need 12, maybe 20, depending on the on the level of study that you're doing and the kind of information that you get from these interviews. So in general, I as a researcher will know that a smaller sample size for qualitative research is appropriate for that kind of research. Whereas for quantitative research, it might need a lot larger. And just making sure that you're aware of those kinds of details is not a bad place. Often people are a little bit weaker in the analysis section of their methodology, but it is a good idea to have at least a general game plan, like that you are going to be using a certain kind of program for your statistics, or you're going to be using thematic analysis for your interviews instead of maybe a different kind of analysis, like qualitative content analysis, for instance. So just a high level understanding of your methodology with enough detail to show that you've thought about the practical elements is crucial. To help with this, having any additional inclusions around your plans is very, very, very nice because it shows that you're thinking about practically what this will entail. Maybe using a Gantt chart or some kind of time structure or something that shows that you've thought about what this research really means. If you put in a timeline and you have 8 months of data collecting and all you're doing is collecting 2 interviews, that's all good and well, but chances are you probably want to do other things while you're doing that as well. So having a little bit of a plan that you present to them visually or in writing, maybe in the appendix of your proposal, is just going to strengthen your proposal overall, regardless of which stage it is that you are sending this proposal in.
Hey, Derek here again. I wanted to quickly jump in to tell you about our free research proposal template. If you are in the process of crafting your proposal, this template will help you structure your thinking and fast track your writing. If you're interested, you can find the download link in the description. All right, back to the webinar.
So regardless of what you end up writing, it's important to think about the reader. Always think about the reader. In fact, that's always a rule for anything that you produce in academia. Think about the reader. And with that in mind, whoever they are, it is important to understand what they're looking for. So whether this is a funding committee, whether this is your supervisor, whether this is your committee or your department, it's really important to think about what it is that they want. And the nice thing is quite often, regardless of who they are, they tend to look for a few very similar things. And I'm going to go through 4 of them right now. The first and always the most important is consistency. It's very disheartening to have somebody send you a proposal where the topic completely doesn't match the theory that you're using or doesn't match the methodology that you're doing. So you really need that sort of consistency, that golden thread. And we do have resources on that throughout this piece. If you start jumping between burnout and anxiety throughout, then that's not going to be a very good idea in our potential example. And it's really crucial to show that you understand those terms. And if you do decide to use different phrasings or terms during your write up, it's important to make it clear that you can and that you will be using them interchangeably at some point. Otherwise, the reader won't know that these are interchangeable terms. Even slightly different terms can showcase a misunderstanding either with you or with the reader or with the literature in some way. So definitely make sure there's consistency in what you're saying and how you're planning on saying it. Even if that means there's a feeling of a slight level of repetition throughout this proposal. The second thing they're looking for is practicality or viability. If you're planning on doing something that could have been done in a simple way, but your methodology is doing something incredibly difficult and wondrous, and there's no reason for the reader to believe that you're able to do that, either because you're proposing using equipment that's way too expensive and not within the department, or you're planning on accessing a group of people that are, that haven't seen Western civilization in decades, then the chances are it's not very practical. You need to be able to have some kind of recognition around what you are capable of doing with the resources that you either have now or will have if you are accepted into this program or a part of this program. So you have to showcase some kind of viability. This is often most crucial in your methodology chapter, but everything needs to build towards that. So having a nice practical topic that you can easily research on and have a clear, easy, or achievable methodology attached to, they do end up falling into each other. If you're studying the origins of the universe, you need to highlight very clearly the kinds of resources that you need access to, and they need to be resources that you will believe that you have access to. So that's something to think about when writing your proposal is what I'm planning to do actually doable? It needs to also add value. Now, at this point, a lot of these points actually align a little bit more with the topic. You hopefully, by the time you came up with your research topic, you would have already considered some of these elements. But value, especially, is something to keep in mind for your proposal as well. And that is because your proposal is the time for you to showcase the value of your research. And you can do so in many sections throughout the proposal. For instance, when you are providing your rationale in your introduction, you can say this research is therefore valuable to this group of people because of these reasons. You can say that this kind of research will have immense value to the business that you're studying, or the institution that you're studying, or the group of people that you're studying. You need to show that there's some level of value. This is very crucial as well for funders who typically want to fund research that also has some societal application or usefulness or insight. And so definitely push for that value aspects in your proposal and make it very clear why it is we should care that this research is being done. From an academic perspective, you also need to show value. You need to show that this research is of some academic interest. It doesn't mean that it's been studied extensively at all, but that that there is some interest around this topic broadly for academic purposes too. You also need to showcase that there's a research gap that you're filling. So this isn't a topic that is very well understood, is very well known, and and you have no reason to believe it's going to be of any addition to the academic literature. So for that, you need to establish what it is that research gap that you're filling in is, and you need to be able to articulate it ideally in the literature review component of the dissertation. So in those spaces, if you show that it's consistent, practical, and valuable, you are kind of touching on some of the elements you probably already thought of in the research topic phase, but now you're able to articulate it. And you really should take advantage of it because now you can justify what it is that your research is actually planning on doing. For a professional dissertation, you're probably wanting something a little bit more practical and usable at a societal business level. For a more academic dissertation, your arguments might be a lot more on the academic side of things. So there might be a little bit of balancing that you might need to think about. But in general, as long as you articulate that value clearly, that is very crucial for them. They also would like you to showcase your level of understanding. Do you need to be an expert yet at this phase? Unless you're doing a PhD or, and you're well into your PhD, probably that's not reasonable. They need to know, though, that you've been reading a little bit about this research, that you have a good understanding as to potentially what theory is most applicable for this kind of research. They need to know that you understand that qualitative research takes a long time, that you're not diving into this research without knowing any of the principles or having done any readings yet at this point in time. So some level of understanding, even if it's a high level of understanding initially, is crucial for them to know that this research is something that you can do and that you are able to do as the researcher, and that you have clear reason to be able to do this. So some level of understanding around the terms that you're using, high level of understanding of your methodology can go a long way, even if the details are not necessarily fully fleshed out yet. So, with our example, and I've already mentioned a few points to consider, but in our example of exploring the factors related to burnout among graduate students in a UK university, lack of consistency would look like you using burnout, anxiety, depression interchangeably without acknowledging the differences between perhaps the definitions of those terms and the way that they're used academically. Lack of consistency would mean initially going to burnout, talking about burnout among graduate students, and then in your methodology, recruiting undergraduates. So any sort of lack of consistency is a big red flag that you don't really have a plan, that you've just sort of thrown things together. So in your initial thinking, try to make sure, do I have a clear, consistent plan? Does the topic align with what I'm saying in the introduction? Does what I'm saying in the introduction align with the topics I'm bringing up in the literature review? Does the literature review align with whatever it is that I'm going to be researching and measuring and or putting in my interviews with these graduate students? And if those all line up, that golden thread, then you are good to go. The second thing is, as I said, is practical. So if somebody is exploring the factors related to burnout among graduate students in the UK university, and they are part of a US university, that might make things difficult. Or if they have no reason to believe that this might pass ethics approval, or that the institution themselves does not want primary research, they want secondary research, and therefore there's no reason to believe that you have access to this group of people or can have approval to get access to these people, then that won't be practical. However, as I said before, for primary research, probably at a master's level, if you're a part of that institution, then it should be relatively practical and doable. Number three, does it add value? Now, for me, I can see that a topic like this is just valuable. It's probably valuable for the university. It's probably valuable for academia to really understand, burnout as a concept just generally. But I think the point that you wanting to use in the proposal is that it doesn't matter if it's obvious. You still need to make it obvious. You still need to highlight, even if it's just a couple of sentences, what that value really is. Why is this important? And same for the academic value. Is there reason to believe that there's still a misunderstanding around the factors that might be related to burnout? Is there still more to unpack? Are there perhaps arguments? Is there some contextual issues, like maybe graduate students in the US have very different experience from UK graduate students, but all the research is only being done in the US. So you need to showcase those values of your research, and you need to articulate them clearly. Maybe an exercise that you can do is to write down, why is my research valuable broadly to society or business or what have you, and also for the academic value as well. And then finally, understanding. Once again, if you are writing a proposal on burnout, you need to highlight the level of understanding that you have on burnout and make sure that you're not confusing burnout for similar terms or similar concepts that might showcase perhaps a bit of ignorance on your side around the big idea that you're proposing. You also need to have some understanding as to why this might be a relevant topic for focusing on graduate students specifically. So showing that you have a broad understanding around the topic and the pieces that your topic are touching on, as well as maybe a high level understanding of your methodology and the practical elements that are entailed there, will be very, very useful, even for what is otherwise a very clear cut maybe somewhat obvious topic for the reader or the examiner or the reviewer to perhaps evaluate on itself. So now that you know what it is they're looking for and what it is that goes into a research proposal, the big question is how do you even start? How do you even get things together? Where do you begin? And for that to truly be unpacked, I think it's very important to firstly and foremost, without any additional, tools or readings or anything, is look at your institutional requirements, look at what is required of you, see if there's a template available. Make sure that you're not just writing a generic proposal when they're asking for something very specific. Maybe they're only asking for 3 elements of a generic proposal. Maybe they are very specific as to what those 3 elements are. Maybe they're even wanting things like personal motivations around your research. So all of this additional this stuff, how they wanted to present it and what they want, and maybe even a word count as to what they want of each component might already exist for that institution. It might save you quite a bit of time. The second thing is identify core readings. And by core readings, I really mean ask yourself what articles are really inspiring this research. What have I found that is close to this research in some way? Maybe it doesn't directly touch on it, especially if there's a big research gap, but what research is inspirational here? What theory are you going to be using? Those are typically older articles that really sort of touch on the definitions and explain the main context around this issue to you. And then thirdly, have your construct or ideas been studied previously? A construct would be something like burnout, an idea that you can sort of pinpoint or evaluate. And so once you've sort of thought about these questions and found those inspirational articles that are close to home and the theoretical articles that are general there, you should have a, an understanding of those. We don't need an extensive number of articles, rather have an understanding of the core literature, even if that's just 5 to 10 articles, then very briefly and badly know 50 or 100 articles before attempting the proposal. Number 3, clearly articulate your research gap. So practice asking yourself what it is, what am I filling? What role am I filling here? And for that, we do have lots of resources here at Grad Coach to help you identify that research gap. But once you are able to articulate what it is that your research is filling in the academic literature, you would have a very clear academic justification for your research. 4, examine your golden thread. Now, as I mentioned before, the golden thread is really just ensuring that your topic, your research aims and objectives are carried through your entire dissertation. But that's true from the proposal stage as well. If you need some more additional resources, we do have that. But try to ask yourself, what specifically am I doing? Is everything I'm doing in my methodology helping me achieve and shed light on my research topic? Or am I drifting a bit? Am I going a little bit skew here and maybe asking, maybe looking at too many additional factors that are not necessarily directly relevant? And then also, step number 5, try to have a high level understanding of your methodology. Try to be able to break down your methodology into a little bit more detail than just qualitative or quantitative or inductive or deductive. Try to ask yourself, for the kind of research that I'm doing, what maybe is an appropriate sample size that is both usable and practical and valuable? Have I thought about perhaps things like ethics and what I'm allowed to do? Like working with minors is probably a no. Whereas, if you have access to people and they happen to, and your research isn't terribly invasive and they're constantly adults, those are all much more viable for primary research. And then finally, once again, it needs to help you achieve your aims and objectives. It needs to feed back to your golden thread and what it is that you're set out to do. And then finally, get writing, because one of the things that sort of holds us back is this need to feel like we have everything 100% sorted in our mind before we even start. And quite often, if you just allow yourself to be creative and write down what it is that you're thinking, where it is that you're hoping to go, you will be able to identify what it is that still needs to be done, what it is that you're missing, what the gaps in your own understanding are. But sometimes it's hard to do that in the planning phase while everything's in your head. So start writing, start getting it down, and rather aim for a little bit of a nastier initial draft and fix that than aim for perfection the first time. So that pretty much wraps up everything for today. And I hope that you got something out of this and found this webinar useful for your own proposal. And I hope that you take our advice and start getting writing. Otherwise, thank you for joining.
All right, so that wraps up the Proposal Writing 101 webinar. Remember, we've got a ton of free resources over on the Grad Coach blog to help you with your research proposal. As always, you can find the links to those in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and be sure to check out the next video over here. I'll see you there.